What is up, guys? Welcome back to day 5, round 6 of the Orillas International Chess Tournament here in Tenerife. My name is Titus Stromavicius. I'm a Grandmaster and I want to share my games and experiences with you from the event. So after 5 rounds, I'm 4 out of 5. Still dropping 1 rating point, but I'm on a 3-game winning streak, so the momentum is pretty high. And I get paired up against another person who has 4 out of 5. Back-to-back China representatives, Wang Chen, who's about 2480 rating, international master. I am black in this game, so my approach is a little bit different, as I've already kind of burned some bridges in this event. So I'm trying to firstly prioritize not losing the game, and then if I'm given any chances, then maybe try to push for an advantage in the later stages of the game. So when I was preparing for my opponent, I noticed that he favors the Rossolimo, which is the e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5 line. And I wasn't sure if I should allow this or not. I was considering maybe playing e6 on move 2, but I wasn't really sure what he would respond to after e6, because he had a few games in all of these lines. He was playing b3, he was playing g3, he was playing d3. There were some games of d4 as well. And historically, e6, at least the way I play it, is more for sort of completely for a draw. So I felt like maybe knight c6 would give me more chances down the line. However, the problem with knight c6, bishop b5 for me currently is that the line that I used to play the most, which is knight f6, a very provocative move. I've played it quite a few times now, and it's run into some problems. Like I've been getting some quite bad positions, and not necessarily scoring badly. I've been actually scoring still relatively well, but the positions I've been getting, I've not been enjoying, and it's been kind of a lot of suffering from the first moves of the game. So I wanted to surprise him in some manner. And I already played a setup with e5 in this event, so I didn't really want to do that because it didn't really work out for me. And I felt like these setups, I'm not very good at them in recent games. So now my kind of options became a little bit limited, and I decided to try this move that I've tried only once in an over-the-board event, and it's been over a year and a half, I believe. I played this move, queen b6. Now I've been experimenting a little bit with the white pieces as well in c4, e5 lines, where you would do this sort of early queen moves. For example, let's say e3, bishop b4, and now queen b3, let's say, or queen c2. I've been experimenting a little bit, or knight c3, bishop b4, queen b3, and some games successfully, some not so successfully. But I thought it's quite interesting. But here there are some issues for black, as why this move isn't very popular, and as to why I probably won't be playing it anytime soon again. First of all, white has a lot of good options in this position already. When I was preparing, I kind of felt that maybe the more exotic-looking moves were quite interesting. For example, bishop a4. A very interesting move, basically saying that you've misplaced your queen. It's not really doing anything. Your development is kind of, delayed. And I'm just going to try and play for some c3 and d4 setup eventually as white. Also thought that a4 could be interesting. Again, just kind of expanding, grabbing a little bit more space, pushing the pawn, and still not committing your knight to c3, just so we have the c3 idea in the future. The most popular move is knight c3. But also another interesting motive could be to take on c6 immediately, which might seem kind of weird. But if I decide to recapture with the queen, I thought that maybe castles is quite an interesting move, foregoing the e4 pawn altogether and playing for the initiative if black decides to capture with, let's say, rook e1 and d4, just to give an example line. And as you can see, all of my pieces are currently undeveloped, whereas white has already castled. His knight is developed, his rook is on an open file, and it's only for a cost of 1 pawn. So I thought this could be also quite dangerous, potentially. My opponent instead decides to go with the classical approach. I think knight c3 is by far the most played move. And I was, kind of expecting it because it's the most played move. So I prepared this probably the most, but still not too much because it's hard to predict what my opponent's gonna play when he has no games in the database. Bishop c6 he decides to take before I develop my knight on e7, because let's say if he had castled, then I could connect my knights and then recapture with the knight on c6, and then the bishop probably will have to retreat to f1 at some point, and it's a totally different flair of the game. Whereas after bishop c6, I had prepared to take with the pawn, so I damaged my pawn structure, and we get, again, I've played this position with white pieces, where I'm approximately 2 tempi up, because usually the queen is on c7, and you're playing white instead of black. The queen on b6 is probably a little bit more misplaced. So definitely the evaluation shifts from being, about equal to somewhat better for white. Computer claims about 0.8 advantage already, so it's pretty big. But I thought that the game could potentially become very interesting. For example, if my opponent, castled, which he did, knight e7, and now if he decides to try to play against these weakened dark squares with, like, let's say e5 at some point, or let's say, first rook e1, and after I play, let's say, queen c7, now e5, then we could get an interesting position, because I would eventually have to break through with f6, and after captures, I would recapture with the pawn and potentially play with the open g file. So I thought this could potentially get very interesting. Instead, my opponent plays a very academic approach and also a very sensible approach, which is b3. Basically wants to develop his bishop on the long diagonal potentially, and immediately fixes this pawn so it cannot advance in the future, right? So, double pawns, you want to fix them and then potentially surround them, corral them, and take them. So it makes a lot of sense. I have to, try to finish my development. I play knight g6. My opponent responds with knight e4. Another sensible move, basically to kick the queen and also put immediately some pressure on c5. Noteworthy that during the game I thought that he would maybe be able to play knight e4 immediately, which I thought was much more sensible. However, my opponent correctly noticed, I believe he noticed it, that I could play queen b4 and launch a double attack on the pawn and the knight. And it's hard to say if white has anything better than going back with the knight to c3. So b3, defending the knight first, makes much more sense after all. And after knight e4, queen c7, rook e1, another sensible move, just sidestepping any bishop a6 moves. I think we arrive at the first sort of critical position in the game for me, where I think I chose a wrong plan. And I probably should have played something more in the lines of e5, f6 in any order. So let's say f6, an ugly move to make, but it makes sense in a couple of moves. C3, bishop e7, d4, cd4, cd4, and e5. And just establish this sort of center control of the dark squares. I have a light square bishop to compensate for the light squares. My opponent does not have a light square bishop. So I think white is still obviously much more harmonious and would be preferred, but we could get a sort of a stable position where I could, potentially outplay my opponent if I play well from this point onwards. I decide to go for d6, and computer really dislikes this move, mostly because of e5. Now, during the game, I wasn't sure how strong was e5. Obviously, I was considering it. My analysis was something like this, and just bishop e3, and then, black wins the pawn back. And I thought that potentially, I could complete my development, and then try to kick this knight out. Let's say I play something, I don't know, like f6. If my opponent decides to take, I don't know if he has to, or maybe he has a better move, but let's say I takes, castles, and I castle, and I thought this position could be quite interesting, but maybe my opponent already has d4. Tough to say. Computer really liked this position for white. I can see why. Like, it seems like white has a nice blockade and a nice initiative already going, so I can see why computer would like this position. So I believe that d6 was a fairly large inaccuracy, all things considered. And I remember looking at some games when I was preparing, and whenever people played d6 before f6, usually it would lead to very bad positions. So I kind of, misevaluated sort of this position that arises after f6 and e5. I thought this position was very unpleasant. Computer says it's okay, or at least better than the alternative, whereas after d6 and e5, the position would have been very tough. However, my opponent plays c3, which is, I mean, it's a decent move as well, but it's less concrete and less sort of challenging. And after a brief thought, I decided to play bishop e6 and try to play for bishop b5 ideas. Again, I'm not sure if it's the best approach, but that's what I ended up going with. And after d4, I decided to try and attempt with rook d8. If my opponent recaptures, I would just recapture and potentially have some nice play with the d3 square. So my opponent doesn't do that. He plays queen c2. And I believe here we had another sort of critical moment in the game where I could have done something different. And according to the computer, it would have been a significant improvement, which was just take on d4. Again, I completely misevaluated this position. I thought this position was very unpleasant. Computer says it's completely fine. We get sort of, again, this block. I wouldn't say a blockade, but, sort of this pawn echelon on the 6th rank, which can draw a lot of squares. I thought that potentially white could play for e5 and undermine it, but I can maybe play e5 myself again at some point and try to go for a similar setup that we already saw. And apparently, yeah, this position after c takes d4, c takes d4, it's completely playable. And I saw some lines where just actually computer like petered out, and at some point it ended with a repetition, something along the lines like this. So it was definitely an option I should have considered. Instead, I played bishop b5, which is a much more direct move, just attacking the knight, and it forfeits a pawn, basically. I have to take on a4. If I decide to do d5, for example, my opponent fortunately has e takes d5, c takes d5, and b4, and the queen protects the knight, and white retains a healthy extra pawn with the knight coming to d4. The position is in white's favor by a lot. So I have to forfeit a pawn, unfortunately, with bishop takes e4, c takes d6, bishop takes d6, ba4, knight e5, and after after knight e5, bishop takes e5, I decided to offer my opponent a draw because he seemed kind of unhappy, even though he was an extra pawn up. And he deliberated for about 15 minutes and decided to accept. I checked on my engine, and then I saw my opponent checked on a deeper engine on his part, and the deeper engine says it's equal. My engine said white is slightly better, which makes sense. I mean, white is up an extra pawn, even though it's a double pawn. Obviously, with perfect play, this should be a draw, but my opponent could definitely have tried, but he decided to not go for it this time, and a draw was agreed. So a much shorter game than any of my previous ones. A first peaceful result as well. I tried to experiment in the opening a little bit with a sort of exotic approach of queen b6. If I followed up with the f6 e5 plan, which I covered, I believe here, then the position could have become double-edged and something I could potentially do well in. But the way I handled the position with d6 kind of eliminated any real chances of going for an initiative as black, and eventually a draw was definitely a successful result given the position I had. So 4.5 out of 6. Next round is today at 4 p.m. And I'll see you on the recap of that game later.